the Zero pilot who described Japan's nightmare when the Mongols returned to the sky. The Zero's engine coughed black smoke while hydraulic fluid streamed past my canopy like tears of blood, and through the acrid haze of burning aircraft fully could see them, wave after wave of American bombers darkening the down sky above Kyushu like storm clouds that had come to devour the sun itself. My Mitsubishi A6M shattered through sick with tracer rounds and exploding shells, the stick heavy in my hands as I fought to maintain altitude over a coastline that burned from horizon to horizon in columns of smoke that reached toward the heaven like prayers for mercy that would never be answered. Below me, anti-aircraft batteries fired blindly into formations so massive they seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world, their muzzle flashes creating a constellation of desperate light against the gathering darkness of defeat. The radio crackled with voices aiding panic as pilots carried out positions and aircraft types in numbers that made no tactical sense, describing enemy formations that violated everything we had been taught about the limitations of industrial warfare. Through the chaos of burning aircraft and exploding shells, I watched American fighters diving toward our positions with the relentless precision of predators that had identified helpless prey, their silver forms catching what little light filtered through the smoke like the armor of mounted warriors charging across an endless plain. In that moment, suspended between sky and sea while Japan died beneath me, I realized with terrifying clarity what our grandfathers must have felt 700 years ago when Kublai Khan's fleets appeared on the horizon, except now the Mongols were returning through the sky, and no divine wind would rise to save us from this invasion that came from above instead of across the waves. None of us knew Japan was about to relive its oldest nightmare. Before I explain how that moment shattered everything I believed about war, stay with me until the end, and make sure you subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this can't disappear. To understand how I ended up in that burning cockpit, we have to go back to a fishing village on the coast of Shikoku where a 7-year-old boy first heard his grandfather speak of the Mongol invasions while mending nets under stars that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of human understanding. That boy was me, and those stories of ancient enemies approaching across dark water would shape my understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the terrible responsibility that comes with defending something larger than individual life. My grandfather spoke of Kublai Khan's fleets appearing on the horizon in 1274 and again in 1281, thousands of ships carrying warriors whose very presence threatened to erase everything that made Japan distinct from the vast continent that sprawled beyond our island shores. The Mongols came with numbers beyond counting, I would say, his weathered hands working the hemp rope with the patient precision of a man who understood that some tasks couldn't be hurried, but the kami sent typhoons to destroy their fleets before they could establish themselves on our soil. The divine wind, kamikaze, saved Japan when human courage alone would not have been sufficient. Those words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning, embedding themselves in my young mind as fundamental truths about the relationship between heaven and earth, between individual duty and cosmic purpose. The village where I grew up existed in harmony with rhythms that had governed Japanese life for centuries: rice planting in spring, fishing during summer, harvest celebrations that honored both human effort and divine blessing, winter months when families gathered around hearths to share stories that connected present struggles with ancestral wisdom. But even in that peaceful environment, there were things that the world was changing in ways that would demand new forms of sacrifice from each generation. Military aircraft occasionally passed overhead, their engines creating sounds that seemed to violate the natural order, while radio broadcasts brought news of conflicts in distant lands where modern nations were testing weapons and tactics that promised to transform warfare into something unrecognizable. When I left home to pursue education in Tokyo, I carried with me not just personal ambitions but the accumulated expectations of ancestors who had preserved Japanese culture through centuries of external pressure and internal change. The city revealed possibilities that village life had never suggested: engineering marvels, industrial achievements, cultural sophistication that demonstrated Japan's ability to compete with any nation on earth. But it also exposed me to political currents that emphasized Japan's destiny as the leader of Asian people seeking liberation from Western colonial domination, ideas that transformed ancient concepts of honor and duty into modern imperatives for military expansion. My first sight of military aircraft came during a demonstration at an airfield outside the capital, where pilots performed maneuvers that seemed to defy physical laws governing Javier air flight. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters moved through the sky with grace that suggested living creatures rather than mechanical constructions, their engines singing songs of controlled power while their pilots executed formations that required trust, skill, and coordination beyond anything yet previously imagined possible. In that moment, watching those aircraft bank and climb against clouds that caught afternoon light like silk screens painted by master artists, he understood that my future lay in mastering those machines that could carry Japanese ideals beyond the limitations of geography. Flight training revealed both the technical complexity and spiritual dimensions of military aviation. Learning to fly the Zero required mastering control systems, engine management, and navigation procedures that demanded absolute precision under conditions that offered no margin for error. But more challenging was developing the mental discipline necessary to function effectively in combat situations where split-second decisions could determine not just individual survival but the success or failure of operations involving entire squadrons. The aircraft became an extension of the pilot's will, responding to inputs that combined conscious technique with subconscious awareness of aerodynamic forces that governed all flight. The instructors emphasized that Zero pilots were inheriting responsibilities that connected them to every generation of Japanese warriors who had defended the homeland against external threats. We were told that our aircraft represented the modern expression of the kamikaze, the divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion, and that our success in combat would determine whether Japanese civilization could survive the challenges posed by enemies whose industrial capacity far exceeded our own. This wasn't a used military service, it was participation in a cosmic struggle between forces that represented different visions of how human societies should organize themselves. But there was also fear that could never be acknowledged openly. American industrial capacity was producing aircraft in numbers that seemed to violate rational economic principles, while their pilot training programs were generating aircrew with technical skills that matched our own despite having far less experience in actual combat. Intelligence reports describe formations of hundreds of bombers protected by fighters whose performance characteristics equaled or exceeded anything in Japanese service. The mathematics of attrition warfare suggested outcomes that contradicted everything we had been taught about the relationship between spiritual strength and material victory. The early months of conflict seemed to confirm our fight in superior training, aircraft design, and fighting spirit. Zero pilots achieved victories against enemy formations that fled rather than engage in prolonged combat, demonstrating the tactical advantages that come from years of intensive preparation and absolute commitment to mission success. American pilots, despite their technical competence, seemed reluctant to press attacks when faced with determined resistance, suggesting psychological weaknesses that could be exploited through aggressive tactics and willingness to accept casualties that enemy forces would find unacceptable. But gradually, the nature of air combat began to change in ways that favored enemies whose primary advantages lie in industrial production rather than individual skill. American aircraft appeared in formations too large to be engaged effectively by the limited numbers of interceptors available to defend Japanese positions, while their pilots demonstrated increasing competence in tactics that neutralized Zero advantages in maneuverability and range. More disturbing was their apparent willingness to accept losses that would have been considered catastrophic in Japanese planning, suggesting access to replacement aircraft and pilots that made attrition warfare advantageous for American forces. The psychological pressure of fighting an enemy whose resources seemed unlimited began to affect everyone involved in air defense operations. Radio frequencies that had once carried confident communications between pilots who knew each other personally became filled with reports of aircraft types and formation sizes that challenged basic assumptions about the scale of modern warfare. Friends disappeared with increasing frequency, their aircraft last seen diving toward enemy formations in attacks that achieved temporary tactical success but couldn't affect strategic outcomes determined by industrial capacity that exceeded Japanese production by orders of magnitude. Intelligence briefings revealed the scope of what we were confronting. American bombers were approaching Japanese airspace in formations that included hundreds of aircraft protected by fighters whose numbers exceeded the total strength of Japanese air defense units. These weren't raids in any conventional sense, they were invasions carried out by air forces whose size and sophistication represented a new form of warfare that rendered traditional defensive concepts obsolete. The sky, which had always been Japan's natural protection against foreign invasion, was becoming a highway for enemies whose capabilities transcended anything our military planners had anticipated. It was during one of these briefings that the historical parallel first occurred to me. The intelligence officer, a nervous man named Kenel Yamamoto who spoke with the careful precision of someone reporting facts which weren't true, described American formations approaching Kyushu with numbers that reminded me of my grandfather's stories about Mongol fleets appearing on the horizon. They come like a sea of aircraft, he said, pointing to reconnaissance photographs that showed formations stretching beyond the frame of the image. Wave after wave, more than our interceptors can engage effectively, The words triggered memories of childhood stories about enemy forces whose very presence threatened to overwhelm Japanese defenses through sheer numerical superiority. But there was a crucial difference between the ancient invasions and what we were facing. Kublai Khan's fleets had been vulnerable to typhoons that could scatter wooden ships and drown thousands of warriors in minutes, but aircraft could operate above weather systems that affected surface vessels. The divine wind that had saved Japan from Mongol invasion offered no protection against enemies who approached through three-dimensional space that rendered traditional geographic barriers meaningless. We were facing adversaries who possessed not just superior numbers but access to an entirely new dimension of warfare that our ancestors had never needed to consider. The mission that brought this realization into sharp focus began on a morning when reconnaissance reports indicated massive American formations approaching southern Japan with objectives that appeared to include every major industrial and population center within range of their bombers. The number seemed impossible, over 500 B-29 superfortresses protected by more than 200 fighters, approaching in waves that would require ours to pass any given point. Our response involved every available aircraft, but even maximum effort could provide fewer than 100 intercepts against formations that outnumbered us by ratios that made a tactical victory impossible regardless of individual pilot skill. Taking off in the grey pre-dawn light, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with climbing into an aircraft that represented Japan's last line of defense against enemies whose intentions toward our civilization remained unclear. The Zero responded to control inputs with the precision that made her superior to any fighter aircraft in individual combat, but superiority in single combat meant nothing against formations designed to overwhelm defensive positions through coordinated attacks that could absorb any losses we might inflict. As we climbed toward intercept altitude, radio reports began describing enemy formations that exceeded anything in previous intelligence estimates. The sky ahead of us was filled with aircraft, not the scattered raids we had grown accustomed to intercepting, but solid masses of bombers and fighters that seemed to extend from horizon to horizon like metallic storm clouds approaching with unstoppable momentum. The sight triggered memories that transcended personal experience, connecting present reality with ancestral fears that had shaped Japanese culture for 7 centuries. This was what my grandfather had described: enemies approaching with numbers beyond counting, their very presence threatening to erase everything that made Japan distinct from the forces seeking to overwhelm our island civilization. But instead of wooden ships carrying Mongol warriors across dangerous waters, we faced aluminum aircraft carrying American aircrews through three-dimensional space that offered no natural barriers to invasion. The parallel was exact and terrifying. Japan was reliving its oldest nightmare, except now the invasion came from above instead of across the waves. The engagement began when our lead elements encountered American fighters positioned to protect the bomber formations from exactly the kind of interception we were attempting. The P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that met us possessed performance characteristics that matched our Zero's capabilities while offering advantages in armament, protection, and high-altitude operation that became decisive factors in combat that developed above altitudes where Japanese aircraft had been designed to operate most effectively. Individual encounters that might have favored Japanese pilots under different circumstances became a part of a larger battle where American numerical superiority could be brought to bear against scattered intercepts. But it was the sight of the bomber formations themselves that completed the historical parallel in ways that transcended tactical analysis. Hundreds of B-29 superfortresses approached Japanese airspace in precise formations that demonstrated industrial capacity and organizational sophistication beyond anything in human history. These weren't used weapons, they were expressions of a civilization that could produce complex machines in quantities that rendered individual heroism irrelevant. The Americans had achieved what Kublai Khan could only dream of: the ability to project overwhelming force across vast distances with precision that made a successful defense impossible. From my cockpit, watching those formations approach with mechanical inevitability, he understood what terror meant in its purest form. This wasn't a fear of death in combat, that was familiar enough to be manageable through training and spiritual preparation. This was fear of cultural extinction, the recognition that Japanese civilization was facing forces that could erase our existence as completely as Mongol invasion might have done 7 centuries earlier. The kamikaze that had saved our ancestors from foreign conquest was absent this time, leaving us to confront enemies whose capabilities exceeded our defensive resources by margins that made a victory impossible through any combination of skill, courage, or spiritual strengths. Individual combat became meaningless within the context of such overwhelming numerical superiority. My-Zero called engage American fighters with some possibility of success, but destroying one or even several enemy aircraft would have no effect on formations that included hundreds of bombers protected by fighters whose numbers exceeded our total interceptor strengths. The battle was lost before it began, not through any failure of Japanese courage or competence, but through arithmetic that rendered traditional concepts of aerial warfare obsolete. The bombers passed overhead like mechanized storm clouds, their engines creating thunder that seemed to shake the earth itself, while their formations blocked sunlight with such completeness that they became a twilight beneath their shadows. From below, anti-aircraft batteries fired into those formations with desperate intensity, creating explosions that looked like fireworks against the vast skull of enemy aircraft. But even maximum defensive fire could affect only a tiny percentage of aircraft involved in formations designed to absorb whatever losses Japanese defenses could inflict while continuing toward objectives that would be destroyed regardless of the cost in American aircraft and crew. It was during this passage of the main bomber formations that the full significance of what was happening became clear to me. Japan was experiencing invasion on a scale that dwarfed anything in our historical experience, but this invasion came through three-dimensional space that rendered our traditional defensive advantages meaningless. The Americans had found a way to bring overwhelming force directly to our homeland without crossing the ocean barriers that had protected Japan from foreign conquest for over 2 millennia. They had become sky-mounted Mongols whose horses were aircraft and whose arrows were bombs capable of destroying entire cities. The bombers continued toward their targets with mechanical precision that suggested industrial processes rather than human combat, but there was also something magnificent about their coordination that transcended mere technological achievement. These formations represented the ultimate expression of democratic societies' ability to organize human effort for purposes that transcended individual interests. Hundreds of young men flying complex machines across thousands of miles of ocean to deliver destruction with precision that served strategic objectives determined by leaders they had never met. It was warfare elevated to the level of abstract art, beautiful and terrible in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between means and ends. My own aircraft suffered damage during an engagement with P-51 fighters that demonstrated both American pilot competence and the tactical advantages that came from fighting as part of coordinated formations rather than individual combat. Engine oil pressure dropped while control surface damage made the Zero increasingly difficult to manage, forcing me to disengage from combat and attempt return to base through airspace that had become a three-dimensional battlefield extending from sea level to altitudes where human survival required artificial life support. But it was during this withdrawal that he experienced the complete realization of what Japan was facing. Looking back toward the bomber formations that continued their methodical approach to targets throughout southern Kyushu, he showed the future with clarity that transcended immediate tactical concerns. This wasn't just one massive raid, it was a demonstration of capabilities that could be repeated indefinitely until Japanese resistance became impossible to maintain. The Americans possessed industrial resources that could replace any losses they might suffer while conducting such operations, but Japan lacked the aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots necessary to sustain effective defensive operations against enemies whose advantages would increase rather than diminish over time. The historical parallel was complete and horrifying. 7 centuries after the Divine Wind had saved Japan from Mongol invasion, the Mongols had returned in forms our ancestors could never have imagined. Instead of approaching across dangerous waters in wooden ships vulnerable to natural forces, they came through infinite sky in aluminum aircraft that could operate above weather systems and deliver destruction with precision that made a successful defense impossible. The kamikaze that had preserved Japanese independence during our ancestors' greatest crisis was absent this time, leaving us to face conquest through capabilities that represented the ultimate evolution of military science. Landing at a base that showed clear evidence of previous bombing attacks, cratered runways, damaged hangars, equipment scattered by blast effects, he felt the weight of historical inevitability pressing down like atmosphere at altitudes where human life becomes impossible without artificial support. The ground crew that helped me from the damaged Zero worked with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood that their current duties might be among the last performed on behalf of a Japan that existed independently of foreign control. In the hours that followed, radio reports confirmed what visual observation had suggested during the mission. The American bomber formations had reached their targets and delivered destruction with precision that exceeded anything in previous raids. Industrial facilities, transportation networks, and military installations throughout southern Kyushu had been effectively eliminated as functional components of Japanese war production. More significantly, the scale and coordination of the attacks demonstrated American capability to repeat such operations indefinitely, suggesting strategic objectives that involved not just defeating Japanese military forces but destroying the industrial foundation that supported independent Japanese existence. The historical irony was profound and bitter. Japan had modernized during the Meiji period specifically to avoid the fact that had befallen other Asian nations unable to resist Western technological and military superiority. Or industrial development, military modernization, and cultural adaptation had been motivated by determination to preserve Japanese independence against foreign powers whose colonial ambitions threatened every traditional society in Asia. But that same modernization process had brought USA into conflict with enemies whose industrial capacity far exceeded our own, creating circumstances where our defensive capabilities were overwhelmed by the very forces we had sought to equal. But there was also recognition that what we were experiencing represented something larger than Japanese defeat or American victory. The bomber formations that had passed overhead demonstrated humanity's ability to organize industrial production and technological development for purposes that transcended national boundaries or cultural differences. These aircraft were products of democratic societies that had mobilized their resources for war with efficiency that exceeded anything achieved by authoritarian systems despite their theoretical advantages in central planning and resource allocation. The weeks that followed brought additional raids that confirmed the pattern established during that morning over Kyushu. American formations approached Japanese targets with numerical superiority that rendered interception ineffective regardless of Japanese pilot skill or aircraft performance. Zero pilots continued to engage enemy formations with courage that honored our military traditions, but individual heroism could not affect strategic outcomes determined by industrial capacity that favored enemies whose resources seemed unlimited by any rational measure. During this period, I found myself thinking frequently about the stories my grandfather had told about Mongol invasion attempts and the divine intervention that had preserved Japanese independence during our ancestors' greatest crisis. The parallels between past and present were exact in all essential details, overwhelming enemy forces approaching with capabilities that exceeded Japanese defensive resources, threatening cultural extinction that would erase everything distinctive about Japanese civilization. But this time, no typhoons would scatter enemy fleets before they could establish themselves on Japanese soil, because the current invasion came through dimensional space that offered no natural barriers to foreign conquest. The psychological weight of this realization affected everyone involved in Japanese air defense operations, but it was particularly devastating for pilots who had been trained to believe that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantages if applied with sufficient dedication and tactical skill. We had been taught that Japanese fighting spirit represented a force that could neutralize enemy advantages in equipment and numbers, but combat experience demonstrated that modern warfare operated according to mathematical principles that rendered traditional concepts of heroism irrelevant when confronted with industrial superiority of the magnitude that American forces possessed. Yet there was also strange beauty in the precision with which American bombing operations were conducted. The formations that approached Japanese targets moved with coordination that suggested years of training and planning, while their navigation and target identification demonstrated technological capabilities that bordered on the miraculous. These weren't crude attacks designed to inflict maximum destruction without regard for strategic objectives, they were carefully orchestrated operations that achieved specific military goals with efficiency that minimized waste of resources while maximizing pressure on Japanese defensive capabilities. The final mission I flew in defense of the homeland brought complete understanding of what Japan was experiencing and what it meant for the future of our civilization. The American formations that appeared on the horizon that morning exceeded even previous demonstrations of their industrial capacity, over 800 bombers protected by more than 400 fighters, approaching Japanese airspace in waves that required most of the day to pass any given observation point. Our response involved every aircraft capable of flight, but total Japanese strength was insufficient to engage more than a small fraction of enemy formations simultaneously. Taking off for what is expected might be my final combat mission, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with serving as one of Japan's last lines of defense against enemies whose intentions remained unclear but whose capabilities were undeniable. The Zero climbed toward intercept altitude with mechanical precision that had characterized every previous mission, but this time the aircraft felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of inevitable defeat had been transferred from machine to pilot, leaving the aircraft free to perform its function while it carried psychological burdens that exceeded human capacity to bear indefinitely. The engagement developed according to patterns that had become grimly familiar over previous weeks, individual Japanese aircraft attempting to penetrate formations designed to absorb whatever losses we could inflict while continuing toward objectives that would be destroyed regardless of our success in downing specific enemy aircraft. But this time, the scale of enemy operations created a battlefield that extended beyond visual range in every direction, transforming the sky into an ocean filled with aluminum vessels carrying destruction toward every significant target remaining in southern Japan. It was during this final engagement that the complete meaning of historical repetition became clear to me. Japan was indeed reliving its experience with Mongol invasion, but the current threat represented an evolution of military science that rendered previous defensive concepts obsolete. The Americans had achieved what Kublai Khan could only imagine, the ability to project overwhelming force directly against Japanese homeland targets without crossing natural barriers that might provide opportunities for divine intervention or tactical advantage. The bombers that passed overhead represented more than military defeat, they were harbingers of cultural transformation that would affect every aspect of Japanese existence for generations to come. The independence that our ancestors had preserved through 7 centuries of careful adaptation to external pressures was ending not through any failure of Japanese courage or competence, but through confrontation with enemies whose industrial resources exceeded our own by margins that made a continued resistance futile regardless of the spiritual strengths we might demonstrate. Yet even in defeat, there was recognition that what we were witnessing represented achievement that transcended national boundaries. The American formations that approached Japanese targets demonstrated humanity's ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances with precision that honored the best traditions of military science. Their pilots were young men who had mastered skills requiring years of training, while their aircraft represented industrial achievements that commanded respect even from enemies whose existence they threatened. Some invasions en. Others hecho for centuries inside the men who survived them. If you want more stories from those who watched history repeat itself from the sky, subscribe. Some memories need voices to stay alive.